Estamos de volta com a programação do primeiro dia de Fórum do Desenvolvimento ABDA 2022. Neste nosso próximo painel, o tema será Blended Finance e Instrumentos.
So our next panel on blended finance and instruments that guarantee the 2030 agenda. So we are back with our program. Our guests will address the importance of mechanisms and instruments that combine the use of public resources and private resources in fulfilling the 2030 agenda. I'd like to invite Rafael Cavazzoni, expert leader in financial markets of IDB, Martin Schröder, director of the KfW in Brazil, and Luana, Ozemela, CEO of DIMA Consult. As moderator of the debate, Paulo, Bouças, director of the Bank of Brazil. Good afternoon. Paulo, welcome. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here, participating in this development forum, which is so important for all the institutions and groups that participate in the construction of a more sustainable community and a more egalitarian country. It's important that in today's debate we can discuss and highlight models, experiences and practices, and the use of this mechanism, blended finance, and other guaranteeing instruments and PPPs. It's important also to be able to share not only the challenges but also alternatives to drive the use of this mechanism based on sustainable development, sustainable projects. And so we will have a presentation, an 8-minute presentation for each of our panel members. And I'd like to initially invite to especially identifying alternatives to strengthen the expanded use of blended or mixed instruments. Luana Ozemela, CEO of DIMA Consult, an international development company which is established in Qatar, which is also an entry door to the Arab markets. She is she is director of relations with donors of NGO in Nigeria in the area of health. She was also officer at IDB in Washington, and she has interacted with dozens of governments, donors, investors, and NGOs in the US, Latin America, Africa, and Middle East. And she writes for the Estadão. Luana, we want to hear you in this debate that will be so enriching for all of us. Good evening. It's an honor to be here sharing a little bit about this important topic. The topic of blended finance, I'd start by mentioning its importance not only for Brazil but for the world, which is the development of innovative instruments. And I'm going to highlight here that the importance of this type of instrument, especially in the context of development of historically excluded populations and marginalized populations. Just to give you an idea, according to an IDB report, there are today around $93 billion that are necessary in order to eliminate gender differences in access to financing. And among black micro-entrepreneurs, there is a demand that is blended finance could effectively be used in order to close these gaps. For example, we have resources that are more accessible and that could be established to establish guaranteeing funds or equity funds, and this would increase the supply of capital to these segments. So blended finance allows not only greater access but also scalability, what we call leverage of resources, the availability of resources in sectors that are still considered too risky and that are considered or that are unknown, and where capital is more difficult to be allocated. And so to give you an idea of the importance then of this kind of instrument, a recent report by OECD on the current state or the state of the art of blended finance in 2021 reports that for every dollar of financing from donors, and the climate theme, for instance, is the example, for every dollar that is donated, $3 were catalyzed from AFC, and from 7 to 8 were mobilized from third-party capital. And so just to give you an idea of the power to catalyze other types of capital that the blended finance instrument can have and did have, and in the climate issue, and has the potential to have in the gender and race issue. And so also to demystify the impression that investing in women and in black populations and indigenous populations, that it's too risky, that it's not profitable.
So my personal experience of raising investment funds, I'll give you one example. We can see that as a black woman in an investment industry in which there's no other black woman acting, I can see a disbelief, because not just because there isn't a track record of women in the investment industry, but because the capital industry is it concentrates as a majority of the profiles of investors and managers. So blended finance is important not only for capital to flow more easily to unattended corporate profiles, but also to be used to leverage and strengthen the credibility of managers who historically haven't been represented. So the emerging managers, so maybe first fund time managers have the first funds that come from these populations. So we can see that by improving this topic of leadership in the segments of the financial market, the companies or the resource allocators, let me just add another topic related to demystifying the profitability of the undertakings in these segments. As a manager and as an associate member of new funds, which have these lenses of diversity, we can see a bias when we make a pitch to raise capital for these populations. So there is a bias a prejudice that people think that the projects are not viable, and the projects do not show this reality very well. The reality is, for example, black women today which own businesses. This is the fastest growing segment in Brazil, and this needs to be addressed and made visible. Why am I saying this? Black women who employ people, in the last 15 years there was an increase in this segment of about 45%. Black women who employ people in their businesses. So the segment of employer black women, it increased 45%, and among white men it reduced 5%. So these are data from PNAD for the last 5 years. So business women, black business women, are growing a lot, and the black corporate market is growing as well. In the last 15 years, because of affirmative action, the number of employers, black employers with higher education, has increased fivefold. So all of this needs to be very visible. We should be very much aware of the fact that the black entrepreneurism is is catching up. It's growing a lot and fast. So we need to look at blended finance as a leveraging tool for the reduction of inequality, and something that can not only in climate, in terms of climate, but also in terms of the social aspects, have an impact. This is very important in the financial system, the development banks as well. Blended finance can revolutionize these types of actions. Finishing up, how can we accelerate change? Because I think we'll have a moment to discuss and talk about that, but I should emphasize that development banks, institutional investors, private equity, financial institutions in general have to co-invest. And with blended finance, they can create pools of capital so that we can leverage and provide more money flowing to unattended segments. So I believe that the innovation, financial innovation, of which DIMA is a part of, can position this topic very well. There are cases of Vale, FINEP, and BNDES, Sandbox, which is very important, which are very important in the sense of creating an environment to design solutions. So we need to do more, but I think that today is an interesting turning point for us to share these solutions. Thank you, Luana. We'll move on with the presentations, and we'll have a debate, and we'll also have some online participations in our chat on the YouTube channel, and the participation is being constant. Many people are manifesting their opinions about the event, asking questions, and it's always very important to have this debate with people who are participating in this forum online, because we are broadcasting this and we're making all of this jointly. Those who are presenting, those who are attending, just watching, so that we can reach consensus for the country development. Moving on with the presentation, I'd like to give the floor to Rafael Cavazzoni, who is a leader specialist in financial markets from the Division of Connectivity, Markets and Finances for the IDB. He has a master's in international law in finance by University of Frankfurt. Rafael, you have the floor. We would like to hear from your experience and know what you can add to this debate on blended finance. Thank you, Dr. Paulo. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon with you. I'd like to greet Luana, Martin, our friends, fellow panelists, and dear audience. It is a great pleasure to participate in this panel on blended finance and guarantee instruments of the 2030 agenda. I'd like to thank for the opportunity to debate this agenda in the presence of the representatives from development institutions that compose the system in Brazil. ABDE has been a strategic partner of IDB, and we are very happy to have signed recently a technical cooperation agreement. And the central objective is to strengthen the associate members. And with this joint effort, we have deepened our ties, and this has been providing a lot of results by means of the ABDE IDB partnership and the project that Luana mentioned. Together, we developed innovative financial solutions in line with the needs of the associates. This joint perspective is in line with the 2025 vision of the IDB that aims to provide more visibility to all in a sustainable manner, with the purpose of recovering the productive sector, promoting social equality, and strengthening the public institutions. That brings us to the topic of this conversation this afternoon, the financial investments that combine philanthropic funds and private funds and public funds on behalf of the 2030 agenda. As you may know, the investments we need to fulfill the 2030 agenda are significant, and according to the UN, that would be among $5 and $7 trillion every year. To redirect this amount of resources to fulfill the SDGs involves balancing this relationship of risk and return of investment in order to attract the interest of private capital and to leverage the impact of the initiatives. And this is a very important concept in the discussions today, which is what brings me to my first point, which is blended finance. This expression that refers to analogous concepts like subventioned resources, hybrid funding, is based on the premise of the public or philanthropic capital, resources dedicated to development, absorbing part of that associated to financing, and rebalancing the risk and return, thus allowing for private capital. So hybrid funding is using one type of capital to leverage another. So we use public or philanthropic capital to leverage market capital. By joining both, we can, allow me to use Leonardo's words, to give to each his own. So the capital, the public and philanthropic capitals have the impact with the leveraging of the first. So the use of blended finance presupposes the usage of innovative instruments, subordinated capital, guarantees, insurances, and grants that allow for the crowd financing, mobilization of private funds to public projects. It's a huge potential for national institutions in the development system to combine in their operations the usage of some of those tools. If before the pandemic we already observed a number of experiences in Brazil, the use of blended finance has been essential for the provision of quick answers in the acute phase of the pandemic. One of the most effective tools used by the government in partnership with the financial institutions in the country was the application of guarantees in its various formats. The theme of guarantees is involved with the topic of this panel. And this is my second panel. I'd like to highlight the support to the funding of SMEs in Brazil and the importance of guarantees for funding this sector. The emphasis in SMEs has a reason. They contribute 65% of the employments in the country, 45% of the working force, but it is most vulnerable productive force in credit, in terms of credit, especially in economic stress. There are two reasons for using guaranteed funds. The use of guarantees in this sector potentializes the use of catalytic financing in line with what Luana said. And here in the IDB we have evidence of this type of funding have positive effects. An assessment conducted by our workshop of external assessment looking at support programs show that the projects supported by indirect credit had an increase of 15% in the employment, 2.4% in salaries, and significant gains in the values of exports and brand registries. The use of guarantees as a catalytic instrument allows us to maintain the decisions of resource allocation at the hands of the private parties, minimizing risks of distortions in the market, and provides for the public sector to establish parameters for certain segments. And in Brazil, the IDB has been supporting the public sector in many projects in line with the assumptions of the blended finance I just presented. During the pandemic of 2019, but of COVID-19, BID has subsidized 10 million reais to support SMEs in Brazil, including funding by granting guarantees to over 1 billion reais to the program FGBA, which we have funded with the New Development Bank. Credit had a tendency of reduction since 2019, so we took a leap in around 45% of the GDP in 2019 to almost 53% of the GDP in 2021.
And the action of development agencies and the impact of guarantees, almost 5 times the volume of capital, and so these were fundamental in order to leverage credit in the period. And this positive experience with concrete results that in my mind go way beyond mere financial volumes and were used in order to protect employment and production in Brazil at a very critical moment of its history, in order to replicate this and encourage in the future the maintenance of credit for segments mentioned by Luana and also productive segments and sustainable segments in the country. And another example is energy, which was developed by BNDES in partnership with LABI in order to support energy efficiency projects in the Procel. And so the clean technology instruments were used, and also reducing the high costs of storage of energy and allowing small companies in Brazil to have minimum conditions in order to conduct these investments in the country. And so if we can mention that these structures have been gaining evidence in the country, we can infer that the use of guarantees was crucial in the period that we have just experienced. And these mechanisms should be expanded if possible to take into account innovations, and these innovations need to be mainstreamed in the productive processes, improving competitiveness in the country, perhaps in a more pro-cyclical growth cycle. Concluding with the lessons learned, blended finance instruments were smart solutions, but there are many challenges. One of the restrictions is that in order to attract capital, external capital, a perfect example of catalytic catalytic capital, we sometimes some of these resources and processes can take time and follow their own regulation and might not be available in all cases at all times. The next topic, in the case of guaranteeing mechanisms, it's important to deepen the analysis, to design structures that are capable of combining two elements that are very important. So financial sustainability and scaling up of the target audience. And so these instruments, they are supposed to be long-standing instruments, and it's important that the design of guaranteeing instruments in blended finance require public capital or international donors. The fiscal restrictions faced by Brazil can become a complex factor in order to enable the former, while reporting requirements, monitoring requirements, and the feasibility of currency exchange. And we need to improve the use of philanthropic capital or capital from international donors. I'd like to conclude saying that it's important to combine financing with technical capacity building. This is essential in the efforts we are in Bio-Amazon credit with which is destined to leverage investments to mitigate impacts of climate change in the Amazon basin. And all this requires training before accessing credit. So in spite of obstacles ahead, we have a clear perception that we have an advanced regulatory framework, strong institutions and sophisticated ones that can provide sophisticated instruments such as blended finance. IDB we are qualified to support these institutions in Brazil in order to develop innovative solutions that will contribute to a more sustainable future for the country. Therefore, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm at your service to continue with the debate. Thank you, Rafael. I will soon begin the questions so that we can conduct a round of discussion. But before that, we are going to hear Martin Schröder, the director of KfW in Brazil. In Germany, KfW connects with 17 other financial public institutions and subnational institutions distributed in the German territory. KfW is geared towards financing of development projects, and one of the agents involved in the Brazil-Germany Technical Cooperation for Sustainable Development. And so we have a lot of support to move forward in sustainability projects. We will now hear Martin on this topic. Thank you, Paulo. Before sharing a few words, I would like to thank Jeanette, president of ABDE, and Angelo Luis for the invitation to come and speak to you today. I think that blended finance topic has come up in almost all the sessions we've had. I can see that it is a firm collective conviction that without strong participation of the private sector, the available financing will not be enough in order to tackle the various challenges. So another common theme that we've heard, we've addressed COVID. Now in Europe we have war knocking on our doors and all the economic impacts that this can bring about, especially, and the theme of sustainability, which is also at the core of German cooperation in Brazil. So just to create a basis for our discussion, I'd like to share a few words on what we've been doing at KfW, especially in Brazil. As an institution, as a development bank in Germany, we've seen strong growth in the last 2 years. These were exceptional years. And I'm sharing this to strengthen the conclusion that crisis moments are times when a public bank plays a special role in society in fulfilling or actually achieving the mitigation of impacts and increasing resilience. KfW last year placed 170 billion in operations and in Germany and in the world, and this was way above past levels, and this is one indicator. The changes in society and societal demands and the demands of our leading boards also has an impact on institutions internally. And generally, I'd like to share with you we are also guided by the SDGs and the goals, the Paris goals and targets. But to implement this means also this entails an institutional transformation as well. And internally, we have been paying attention to this and also the topic of digitization, how to include digitization more and more in our products. And so the importance of taxonomy and how to convert this into or include this in our operations. And so my message, the message of the German Development Bank, is a message of transition and of facing more and more challenges. In Brazil, the financial cooperation the German cooperation is focused on natural resources, forests. That's a major part of our portfolio. And also renewable energies. Rafael, you also mentioned the guaranteeing fund, the FGE, or the GEF, and this is a very important part of our cooperation here in Brazil, as it has been in the past decades. And in order to maintain this focus area, which is urban development with a strong focus on sanitation and mobility, all this is related to the topic of climate, our home, our starting point. So, in order to I would like to complement that by saying that we are in the last phase of our internal evaluation, and from now on we will contribute to an innovative guaranteeing fund. And so the two words, scale and innovation, this is very important for blended finance. How to ensure that the intelligence of concepts in a guaranteeing fund will really work so as to generate impact and scale. This morning, Gustavo Montesano said that it's both. We still need scale and in order to tackle major challenges. And so the guaranteeing fund, the FGE, is a key element to insert the services that are required in order to confer more confidence in the banking sector. Technical cooperation between entities and services and banks, this needs to work, and I see that this is going to be well designed and will be an element of success for the fund, and also the lab, which was also mentioned as the incubator of ideas for blended finance in Brazil. Allow me to point out that I would like to point out that the loans are still important in financing projects and partners, in the structuring of projects, also with elements of private banks and private sector, also classify as blended finance. And so I'm thinking of the major changes that are still necessary in order to take a further step, for instance, with renewable energies. At KfW, in the past we financed many wind farms, and also through BNDES. And the infrastructure themes are still important and will require scaling up and long-term loans from public development banks. So, as a second point. The third point, Rafael, you classified the options, and I would like to point out the bonds. We are proud of having launched in COP26 in Glasgow the LAC Green, which is a fund that will take investments and green bonds to Brazil and Latin America. The fund is starting with $90 million on the European side, and also the German Ministry for Development and Economic Cooperation. This is a concrete example of how to take more financing to the innovation sector in Latin America, an essential element that ensures quality of the discussion and preparation through technical assistance. Once again, it's an aspect of cooperation. And with this, I'd like to conclude. Thank you. KfW is with you in Brazil, and it's a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to great discussion. Thank you, Martin, for your participation. I took a look at the chat, at our interaction, and we have a lot of participation and praise from Carolina Vivaldi, Gé Roberto Faco, Silvana Cirqueira. But one question drew my attention 2 panels ago, and I'd like to bring it here for our discussion. I didn't take note of the name of the person because my chat limited. I faced some limits here. I think it was Patricia.
So the question was about the access to lost funds. When we talk about actions like foundations that provide assistentialism, we reach another level when we discuss mixed funding involving public and private mechanisms for sustainable development in terms of grant assistances. And it seems that there are still some issues to be internalized for people who are discussing this format of funding. Blended finance started 5 years ago only. So my question is to all of you. I'd like to start with Luana. How can we reach this part of the convincing of all participants beneficiaries as well as the institutions that will be conducting this partnership, this public and private partnership, to reach dissemination until we reach the necessary resources for the availability of those who need to have access to these funds. What would be the viable or the feasible format for this approximation? Well, it's a matter of nomenclature of taxonomy, blended finance. It seemed very innovative 5 years ago, but we had been working with guaranteed funds, grant assistance funds, for a long time, actually. So I believe it's important to highlight that this concept is not a completely new concept. If we look at a recent report of Wharton, for example, we have a project called 3.0. They did a mapping of the financial instruments with a focus on the reduction of inequality, private equity, venture capital, so funds with profitability, which have adopted special lenses for diversity themes, either in their focus or in the work with the managers, or impact in the communities. So they show more than 5 billion, 130 funds which are managed with this aspect in mind. Over $5 million in only a small analysis. So we know that in Brazil this concept, it sounds very new, but what it aims to do, which is to provide capital for certain sectors, industries, business sectors, where there is small perception of risk, is not very new. But we need to be aware of the fact that despite the fact that a lot has been done in terms of climate change and energy efficiency, and the SDGs are going in a constant pace of progress, and this SDG, other SDGs are delayed. Well, we're not stagnant, but during the pandemic, the SDG 5 and 10, for example, which are dedicated to inequality, they've gotten worse. So we are further from the targets than we were. So these instruments need to be very quickly implemented, with a focus in other SDGs as well. And this feeling of urgency related to the other SDGs which we are addressing, we are talking about inequalities that can be corrected with capital, with investment and focus, with instruments like these guaranteed funds and insurance funds as well. It's a type of inequality which is very evil and very costly to Brazil. It's an inequality where we have over half the population excluded from certain development processes in terms of economic participation, and that block the social mobility, ascending mobility of those populations. So we should stop thinking and start acting with the financial institutions to implement these this, these instruments. In the rest of the world, they are already operational. We have examples of over 150 funds that already work with social inequalities. So here maybe the main message, the main takeaway would be we have advanced a lot in climate change because of blended finance, because of these types of tools, and because of this intentional strategy. We have to do the same for other SDGs. Great, Luana. I'll just change the question to Rafael. Rafael, I'd like to hear from you what would be the possible pathways so that we could use the blended finance mechanism in Brazil. I think there are a number of different areas that we can address, and we can address each of them in a different manner. In my previous participation, I talked about the long-term funding for SMEs. This is a central topic given the importance of SMEs in Brazil, but also considering a perspective of improving productivity. We have some data here showing that SMEs in Brazil, they only contribute with 29.5% of the GDP in Brazil and almost 1.5% of the total value of exports. When there is better integration of SMEs in the global value chains, and when the financing to this type of business is guided or directed to companies that have the possibility of taking a leap of productivity, even though they're micro businesses, if we use mechanisms like guaranteed funds to minimize the perception of risk and foster the productivity gain, in a pro-cyclical perspective, it will be very important to consider how guaranteed funds, which were established to respond to COVID-19, maybe can be maintained or redirected so that the productivity gain can be reached, acting through the national development institutions, because it has been demonstrated that they can act efficiently and they can efficiently allocate resources given their regional presence and local realities to support the chains that can provide for productivity gains and to make possible for Brazil to have a more competitive scenario. Second point would be to consider a digital perspective. Open banking in Brazil completed 1 year of existence in February. We have millions of interactions sharing data within the financial systems. So we have 821 institutions participating in this system. Banks, fintechs, and payment mechanisms. PIX was created by the central bank to transfer resources from the financial sector, has accounted for 125 million users, and the number of transactions has reached 1 billion transactions. And how can we take advantage of this context with resources of blended finance to digitize, on the one hand, the national development system, and on the other hand, the SMEs and Brazilian companies, the emergence of startups and digital inclusion, so that Brazil can implement a participation in this type of activities. For example, the United States contributes with a very important part of the productive chains in the country. So this is one other element that I will think of, and other elements of blended finance that could certainly help advance this agenda. The third is financial inclusion from the perspective of gender and diversity. I believe that this is an important topic in Brazil. 36.4% of businesses are led by women, but 58% of credit is given to SMEs who are men. So there is a distortion. If you look at the profile of credit, most of the credit offered to SMEs is $5,000. This is very low, because there are a number of evidences that 37.7% 50% of SMEs in Brazil who are African Brazilian declare they have difficulties in getting credit. Most of them don't seek out credit, so it's larger than the proportion of whites declaring difficulty to access credit. It is another very important element to address. And the third and most important is infrastructure. In the opening, the president of the NDS said that if we want to advance a productivity agenda, of inclusion agenda, and improve sustainability, we need to plan the country with this perspective. And here we have PPPs, funding guarantees for subnational PPPs, sectors that at the same time incentivize the guarantees and the conception of sustainability topics in the design of the projects that can be an efficient way of mobilizing the capital, so for funding and also to advance in this agenda of productivity in the country. Thank you, Rafael. I would also like to remind us of the role of our associate, or our members of ABDE in development, with guided microcredit, making development go to their local contexts, as it was mentioned by President Montezano in the opening, talking about small funds that transform individual lives. So to close with a question to Martin, I would like to know from him what would be the main financial instruments, innovative financial instruments, which would be capable of incentivizing and fostering this partnership between the public and private financial sectors in the international level and in the national level as well, provided your participation is in Brazil and also with Germany. Thank you. The round of questions started with the outright grants or grant assistance. Let me start with that, because we have been discussing internally the green premium to generate the baseline of a grant, non-reimbursable grant. So we as banks need to convert these grants into smart incentives, and this is one of the examples. A grant element can also be more attractive to traditional lines connected to businesses, so this is why we're using blended finance. This is one of the concrete elements that we could have. I'd like to take the opportunity to touch upon the social aspect. So there are environmental topics, and in terms of energy, we have a lot of challenges, and I can only speak of the German cooperation. We will continue working with Brazil in this environmental agenda towards the transition to Brazil and a world that is more compatible with the with the Paris objectives
and the 2030 agenda. Thank you. Thank you. We are approaching the end of our panel, and I'd like to thank Luana, Rafael, and Martin for their participation. But I need to introduce two videos of our members here, and so I invite you to watch a brief video from Age Rio and also Desenvolve Mato Grosso. Let's go. We greet all the participants of the 7th Forum of Development promoted by ABDE. I'm Jair Marques, president of Desenvolve, It's a pleasure to share with you a little bit of the experiences that we have had in the past 2 years of the pandemic. All our actions geared towards micro and small entrepreneurs to provide credit lines with facilitation and programs directed to micro companies, and we were able to conduct more than 2,000 operations during the pandemic. We are developing a program focused on young people and women, intensely working with SEBRAE. The state of Mato Grosso, understanding difficulties, also created its own fund, MT Garante, to provide opportunities for those who did not have access due to lack of guarantee, so that they can also conduct operations with development agencies. It's a unique moment, and we believe that with the resumption of the economy, we will play a very relevant role as facilitator of investments for micro and small entrepreneurs. So it's important that these actions be conducted, and to this end, we are developing partnerships with the municipalities, trade associations of all municipalities in the state of Mato Grosso, important partnerships that will provide support in all the municipalities of the state. And so we want our actions to expand through these partnerships and also consortia, and that credit can reach everyone. We are also developing partnerships in order to qualify our entrepreneurs to monitor credit through partnerships with the municipalities.